Good morning from Finsbury Park. Beautiful sunlight this morning. On the weekend I did a workshop, wildland dreaming, and I recorded the introductory talk. So this is a brief introduction to the introduction, in which I was exploring some ideas, sharing some ideas that I've been thinking about as to the inspiration that is there to be had in indigenous cultures, in pre-modern cultures, which were at the same time a strongly place-based culture, also a story-based culture. So story was like riven through their culture, and it connected them not just to their human lives and relationships, but also to the land, their surroundings. Really strong sense of belonging, connection to place, that in modern life some of us struggle to find. So it's a talk about how those cultures can help us to overcome our sense of alienation, the sense that we don't belong, the sense that we're adrift in our lives. I'm not setting out to be an expert in indigenous cultures. I'm not an anthropologist, so just put that out there. And it was the first time I'd done anything like this, recording my teaching, so it's not a BBC quality video. We'll build on what we've done this time. It's fine, you get it, but it's a little bit shaky towards the end. We need to buy a tripod. Okay, so I hope you enjoy the introductory talk. See you next time. So, wildland dreaming, introductory talk. So, basically it's a day exploring our imagination and the role that plays in our connection to place, in the role that imagination plays in our sense of belonging, and our sense of being rooted in a particular house, garden, street, borough, and our ties to the road verges, parks, rivers, blackbirds, oak trees, street lamps, bridges. And we're going to take inspiration from the Australian Aboriginal tradition, which is a culture that's very, very much connected to the land. So it's a really strongly place-based culture. But interestingly, with regards to imagination, it's also a story-based culture, and they bring those two things together. So I'm going to draw inspiration from the Aboriginal tradition and what they call in English dreamtime, also known as the dreaming, and I've called it wildland dreaming, which is a phrase I've taken from a guy called Martin Shaw. But before we get into what is dreamtime and the relevance it might have for us in the modern world, and for people who live in cities, let's look at the issue of having a lack of connection, a lack of belonging. So I'll give you this great line, one of my favourite lines from Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is this American guy who, he was a writer, he lived in New York, but then he went back to live on the land where his family had lived for generations, and he farmed in the way that they've lived for generations. And he's got this great line. He's talking about an old bucket that he passes every day on his walks, and it's a bucket that's been hanging on this fence post, and like leaves have fallen into it over the years, and birds have crapped in it over the years, and it's creating soil in the bottom of the bucket, and it's a rusty old bucket. And he says about this bucket, he says, however insignificant a landmark the old bucket is, it is not trivial. It is one of the markers by which I know this place and know myself. Okay, so I'll just read that again. However insignificant a landmark the old bucket is, it is not trivial. It is one of the markers by which I know this place and know myself. And I just love that, and intuitively, I know what he means. What I get from that is the sense that his self is stitched together by these various landmarks, these buckets, gateposts, a corner of a field, a doorknob, and the relationship that he has with these markers and how they sort of share his life with him. They witness him on good and bad days. They remind him of his past. They kind of connect him to where he is. They embed him in that landscape, and also it gives him a sense of who he is. Who he is isn't separate from where he is. And yet, if I ask myself the question, what are the markers where I live that remind me of, that connect me to where I live and who I am and my sense of self? I don't find that an easy question to spontaneously answer. And if you let me generalize, I think I've just, not just talk about me, but like modern people, modern life doesn't prioritize our connection to place, doesn't prioritize our connection to the land. And in many ways, it acts against having a connection to the land. It acts against our relationship to place. Because by and large, modern people are people that live in cities. We're citizens. And living in a city, in so many ways, we're separated from the land. So, for example, we don't grow our food. We go to Tesco's, we go to Waitrose. We don't get water from the land, from streams, from rivers. We don't wash outside in the cold. We get water from the tap. We live inside, by and large, for most of our day. So we're literally separated by walls from the outside. If it gets dark, you don't need to experience the darkness. You can turn on a light. If you're cold, you turn on the heating system, etc., etc., etc. So in so many ways, you step outside, you travel around in a car. In so many ways, we're separated, and we've learned to control our surroundings and manipulate our surroundings. And in some ways, we spend more time with machines and in man-made environments than we do with the natural world. And this works against our connection to place. It works against our relationship to place. However, like I said, the Aboriginals had place at the heart of their culture. So I just want to take a look at Aboriginal culture in general as a context for a definition of Dreamtime. So first of all, like I said, it's place-based. So Aboriginals, they lived in small communities, not in cities, small communities, in the land, spending most of their time outdoors. They didn't really even build shelters, really. And they lived most of their life moving around as hunter-gatherers. So their culture's focused on how to live in this land. The animals and plants that lived there, where and when it was best to gather macadamia nuts or red bush apples, and where and when it was best to hunt for kangaroos and emus. This was what concerned them. So they developed a sensitivity to the weather, the land. They knew it intimately. And beyond practical considerations about how to get food, this practical knowledge was kind of woven into a belief system and their spiritual lives. They were part and parcel of living with the land on the land's terms. So they lived in relationship with the land, and they saw themselves as being not dominating the land or separate from the land, but part and parcel of a wider ecosystem, if you like. So their culture, their identity, their spirit was tied to the land and the food that they ate, and their customs and practices and beliefs. And alongside the place-based emphasis, there's a story-based emphasis, because if you live in the one place for generations, and you live where your parents have lived, and they lived where their grandparents lived, and so on, then each little rock, each waterhole, each little dip in the land comes to be named, and it comes to have stories told about it. And those stories would hold practical wisdom. They would teach people how best to live in that land, how best to preserve the purity of a waterhole, where and when not to hunt a kangaroo, thus to preserve their population for future generations. So indigenous people, aboriginal people, their life on the land was kind of like a character who lives within a story. So the landscape is, if you like, the stage of the story. And the characters in this story are the humans, the aboriginals themselves, but also the other non-human characters. So that the plants and the animals, even the places, they had an agency, they had a personhood, a presence, a sensibility, just like human beings did. And the events in the story were the interactions between these characters, human and non-human. So that non-human characters, if you like, had agency and personhood is what defines their culture as animistic. So everything, not just human beings, had an intention, had a significance. Things didn't happen randomly, they happened for a reason. So a tree contained the wisdom of an ancestor, or a sky told us about the future, or a dip in the land could be threatening or welcoming, a good or a bad place. So the world was alive, and just as humans were aware of the world was aware back of them. So as they walked through the land, as they walked over the land felt them pressed down into it, and the trees heard them walk past, and the trees had feelings and thoughts about them, etc., etc. But to modern people, the world isn't alive in that way. We've largely lost that, unless you read Lord of the Rings. We don't tend to live in an animistic worldview. The modern story is that the world is kind of dead. It's an object to sit upon. It's not something to be in relationship to. So if we take that context as a definition for dreamtime, or wildland dreaming, what is wildland dreaming? Well, it's the dreaming of the land, it's the stories and voices in the land, and it's the imagination that allows us to hear those stories. In particular, Dreamtime contains the stories of the ancestors, it contains stories about the past, origin stories of creation. It also tells us about the future, it has intimations of things to come. So Dreamtime kind of synthesizes the past, the present, and the future. So when you're in Dreamtime, you're in touch with the past, the now, and the future, which is hard for us to get our head around. Also, Dreamtime for Aboriginals is a complex memory system. So it's kind of like a cultural repository of ancestral knowledge. Genealogy of ancestors, ethical and legal precedents, initiation rites, marital customs, as well as hunting and gathering techniques. And the Dreamtime comes from an oral culture, so this is before literature. So none of the Dreamtime wasn't written down, it was passed down as an oral tradition between the generations. And how people remember the Dreamtime was that the landscape itself was the mnemonic, the trigger, if you like, that reminded people of key events in the stories. So a particular tree would trigger in the mind of the Aboriginal a character or an event connected to that place. So in a way, the story existed in the land, and as the Aboriginals went on walkabout, if you like, they would hear these stories, they would hear these songs, they would recite the stories and sing the songs, and in that way they would keep the dream time alive and stay in touch with the dream time. So the dream time is not the product of human dreams, but it's a product of the earth. So that's all well and good, but what's that? What can we do with that today? How can we apply that to our lives? What can we take from that? Because modern people don't live in the dream time. We live in a story of our surroundings as objects, as dead matter. Whereas the land doesn't have feelings, it doesn't have a voice, it doesn't have dreams. And that's useful, that's allowed us to kind of step back from the world and analyse it and create things like aeroplanes and stuff. But on the downside, that's created a sense of separation. It's disconnected us from our sense of belonging to where we are. And if you like, you could say that that's at the root of the spiritual crisis behind a lot of the problems in the world today, which is to say we're alienated from the land. And if you like, modern life requires us to separate ourselves from the land, from where we are. There's just so many people in cities that you can't but help objectify them. You can't insult hundreds and hundreds of people as you walk by them. You end up objectifying them, etc., etc., etc. We just get through to try and get somewhere else, and we don't really attend to where we are, because life can be overwhelming sometimes. So we cut off, and then that alienation from the land gets internalized, and we get alienated from ourselves. We cut off from feelings, we cut off from thoughts. And alienation is like an incredible word, because it suggests that we're walking around and the places that we live are as to us as a Martian would find them if they came down and landed here. The Martian would look around, look at Marks and Spencer's, look at Tooley Street and think, this is really weird, this isn't me, I don't belong here, this isn't where I should be. It would be alien to them. And before psychoanalysts were called psychoanalysts, and before they were called psychotherapists, they were called alienists. So the root of the psychotherapeutic tradition was to deal with the problem of alienation, which was beginning to get noticeably worse towards the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. People became increasingly alienated. Why did they become alienated? Because they're living in an alienating culture, and it drives us mad. So, a couple of questions. What can we learn from Dreamtime, and how might we incorporate it into our modern everyday lives? And I think the first place to start is to understand that where we come in at the Dreamtime is fundamentally different from the place that an Aboriginal Australian would come at the Dreamtime. A traditional Aborigine has a baseline assumption of living in an animate world. And then they add to that the Dreamtime. And the Dreamtime will give them practically useful knowledge on how to live in that land. For modern people, some people who are like really into shamanism, they might use something like Dreamtime or some kind of trance to actually find practical knowledge about who they are and what they should do. In other words, as a sort of means to an end. But I think for most modern people, and this is where I'm going to come from today, the discovery and exploration of something akin to Dreamtime is less about the information that we get from it not least because we don't have the cultural inheritance for that to be the case, but more about the imaginative perception that we cultivate along the way to approach the world like that. So we can approach the dream time not in order to recreate a whole cultural system from Australia, but to recreate the type of imagination in our own lives that might allow something of that culture to re-emerge over time. But first of all, it can emerge in our individual lives. Because while it's extremely unlikely that suddenly we will be in an animistic culture, it's perfectly possible for modern individuals to find a place for animism in their everyday lives. So why would we want to do that? Because in and of itself, this imaginative experience that we're calling Dreamtime, this reconnecting with the animate, storied world, is a healing of our alienation from place. It is a step towards finding a sense of belonging and connection to where we land. So Dreamtime holds for us the possibility of finding a way back to a story about our surroundings that returns us to the relationship-filled sense of belonging and participation of our ancestors. So it's a story about our surroundings that does not stop at rational understanding, a story about our surroundings that goes beyond an objectified stance. It's a story that moves us from being a spectator on the outside looking on at the world into a story within which we exist as a character on an equal footing with all the other characters that live in our house, in our street, in our parks, in our borough. Okay, so that's your input.